Welcome to a special In the Name of the Law, Race in America, with your host Liisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm and co-host Takura Nyamfukudza from Chartier Nyamfukudza PLC.
Good morning and welcome to In the Name of the Law. Today we're bringing back Takura Nyamfukudza, a criminal defense attorney with a statewide practice, and he is bringing us a very relevant topic right now with race in America. We have a great lineup of guests, and I'm going to turn it over to Takura to let him introduce all these wonderful people we have with us today. Takura?
Thank you so much, Liisa. Today we are joined by the pit bull and skirt, as some have called her, my business partner, Mary Chartier, Dr. Alane Laws Barker. She practices locally. She's an OBGYN and was also recently appointed to the Governor's Task Force on Child Abuse and Neglect. We also have Conor Long, who is a wide receiver, cornerback, and safety of the East Lansing Trojans. He works at Chick-fil-A. This young man has a resume that's much more impressive than mine was when I was even twice his age. So he also wrote, though, a very powerful essay, which brought the entire house down. I hope he'll share a little bit about that essay with us. Also, he's a member of Jack and Jill, so he is active in the community. He does a lot, and he does it well. So with that, I would like to go directly into the questioning. And my first question is for Conor. Now, often we hear people talk about what it is to grow up as a young man today in America, a young Black man. And actually last week on the first episode, we heard from a father who's raising two young men. But I'd like you, Conor, to speak to us about what racial profiling means to you. And I'd like to know whether you've experienced it at the hands of a police officer.
Yes, sir. To me, racial group of Black playing football on our practice field, maybe with colorful do-rags, white beaters, and the speaker. That may look suspicious to some. And then 3 police cars pull up on them and search their bodies, their backpacks, and other belongings, and ask several unnecessary questions just because they can. Also, it's a police officer pulling you over because of a suspected broken taillight, but you think maybe it's just because of your tinted windows and your loud music. I've experienced both of those.
And we'll talk more about that. And actually, nationwide, there are changes. Some states are moving with greater speed than others, but there are changes in the works to take money from certain police functions and perhaps have social workers respond to certain scenes where it's really not helpful to have an armed individual respond to someone who is in crisis because of mental health or something else. Now, I'd like to direct my next question to Dr. Laws Barker. What is the significance of the Ingham County Health Department declaring racism a public health crisis? And would you please speak briefly about why COVID-19 has had such a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people?
Good morning and thank you. I believe that it is very significant for the Ingham County Health Department to have declared racism a public health crisis. Many people of color know that racism is a public health crisis because we live it every day. When you think about disease, which is typically what we treat at Ingham County Health Department, you wouldn't think about racism. But when you compare racism to, let's say, a disease such as cancer, we know that that is one of the most feared things for many people all over the world. What does cancer do? Cancer blocks your ability to get proper nutrition into your body. It blocks your ability to enjoy a happy and quality life. It blocks your ability to do well at work and have opportunity. Racism does the same thing. Racism causes a community to be a food desert. No good grocery stores, lack of access to food. Racism deprives people of lack of opportunity. If you can't get a good job because you were overlooked, you can't get health care, you can't get benefits, and you can't achieve economically to provide to for your family. So I think it was very significant for the Ingham County Health Department to declare racism a disease or a healthcare problem, because it definitely is, and it impacts people physically, emotionally, socially, It really is a disease, and I'm glad that we are now addressing it as such. One of the biggest impacts where I see racism as a disease also, think about infant mortality, because women of color, particularly African American women, have an infant mortality rate of that of a high school dropout for a Caucasian woman. Why would an educated woman have that type of infant mortality rate? Many times we think lack of education does it. Many times we think obstacles to healthcare does it. But we have educated African American women having an infant mortality rate of that of a Caucasian high school dropout. So we know the impact of racism, and this way the community can address it as a disease and prepare ways to try to overcome this issue. And as far as COVID-19, I believe it disproportionately affects African Americans because of the nature of how we work and how we live. A lot of times, the jobs that we have, particularly everyone saw the bus driver, lots of people are coming in and out, coughing on him, so the exposure is higher. Working in stores and restaurants and those kind of jobs cause you to come in contact with many more people than maybe other jobs would. And then add to it our living conditions. We often live in cities that are very densely populated, and then add the other aspect of not being able to get the quality of healthcare that you might need. So you suffer from hypertension and diabetes, and those things make you predisposed to have a worse outcome from COVID.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mary, my next question is for you. I'd like to know whether America has a problem with selective memory, or do people just need to forget about certain events? For example, it seems that the same people who are up in arms about some broken windows in the wake of George Floyd's murder say nothing about the Tulsa race massacre. And it turns out, apparently, I don't know if he's going to follow through on it, but the president plans to have on Juneteenth of all days, a political rally in Tulsa. Now, I won't talk about what I think the significance of that date and those locations in terms of that political rally are, but I'd just like you to speak about that selective memory, or do we just need to forget about certain things?
Well, no, we certainly don't need to forget about our history, right? When I hear politicians or government officials or people say, oh, well, move on, right, and seem to enjoy living in a state of ignorance, I just want to, scratch my head and scream, right? If we forget our history, then we are doomed to repeat it. And you see that with exactly what you spoke about, which is Mr. Trump deciding to have a rally on Juneteenth. Now, he has changed that. He said he's going in, I believe, the day before. But if it's intentional, it's incredibly insulting and thoughtless. And if it's not intentional, you see what happens when people don't understand history, right? And even in just the past few days, the government has rolled back healthcare for transgender individuals, and they announced that on the 4-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. I mean, history is critical to everything that we do. And I think people when they want you to forget history, it's because they don't want you to think about all the atrocities and the discrimination and the systemic prejudice that has existed in this country and that has built this country and brought us to where we are. So what do we do about it, right? Well, we have a responsibility as individuals to educate ourselves, and we're so lucky with the time that we live in and where we live. In Michigan, we have the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. Grand Rapids has an African American museum. Kalamazoo has just one of many spots in the state of Michigan that relate to the Underground Railroad. Last week, you talked about redlining and segregation. I believe it's the Alfonso Wells Park near 8 Mile in Detroit. There's actually the wall that still exists that segregated Black Michigan citizens from white Michigan citizens in our state, in our lifetime. Now, people have painted murals on the wall, and it's very cool to see, but the significance of it is what has been going on in our state and still continues, as Dr. Laws Barker talked about the public health care system. So instead of ignoring history, we need to embrace it. And we're at a time where we can do that. We're also at a time where if you said documentaries, I don't know, 10 years ago, right, people's eyes would glaze over and they'd say, oh my gosh, I don't have the energy to watch that. But now there are so many fantastic documentaries, including 13th, which is on Netflix, which talks about how mass incarceration has just taken over our nation, and the large number of African American men and people of color we are literally locking in cages. And how did we get that way? And it's not the criminal justice system, right? I mean, we call it that because we're used to it. If there's justice, it's only by chance. It's not because of the way the system was designed. I mean, it's really the criminal prosecution system, which results in people going to prison for far longer than if they were Caucasian. And we could spend a whole show on talking about the crack cocaine and the cocaine disparity, right? Crack cocaine was viewed as a Black person's drug, and cocaine was viewed as a white person's drug, which is why you had 100-to-1 disparity in how individuals were treated with those drugs. So rather than ignore history, which is what people want us to do when they want us to divide us, right? They want to divide us. They don't want us to unite. Because if we start realizing all the commonalities that we have, then politicians, corporations really are going to be held accountable for the actions that they're taking. History is critical in uniting us, and we can't ignore it. We absolutely can't ignore it.
Thank you for that very thoughtful response. Now, Liisa, we have focused a lot on criminal law, but please tell us how injustice manifests itself in family law and the appellate arenas, if you would, please.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it actually reveals itself more in the child welfare arena, which also involves children. And I know the majority of child welfare cases in the state of Michigan come from Wayne County. And I think even if it's not Wayne County, I think the cases disproportionately affect people who are indigent. And they're not necessarily bad people. They may not know better because they're raising their children the same way that they were raised, and they don't know anything different. And I think it disproportionately affects people of the African American community, but especially the indigency problems, because I've seen case after case where parents' rights are terminated, not because they're not wanting to, they want to take care of their children, but they just don't have the resources and they're poor. And if you can't get a job and you can't feed your kids, well, we have resources in the state of Michigan that should be able to help them. And DHS should be able to get involved and help the parents find a path to being able to raise their kids. And so being poor should not be a reason for you to lose your parental rights to your children. And in the family law context, I think, I don't know that there's as much litigation with people who are poor because they can't afford to litigate. They can't afford to hire an attorney. And so if you have one person in a couple, a parent, if one person has the resources to go to court and the other person doesn't, the person who can't afford to have an attorney might very well lose custody of their children, not because they're a bad parent, but because they have been out-resourced. And in the family law side of it, they don't get the right to an attorney like they do on the child welfare side of it. So in child welfare, it's the state that's coming in and interfering with the family, so they do have a right to an attorney at least. But in the family law context, they don't have that, and they're out there fighting for themselves and fighting for their children with very little resources. So it definitely affects children, and it affects keeping the families together, because that's what we really want. We want families to be able to stay together. And when there's poverty issues and discrimination issues, it's harder for the families to stay together. But it's the best thing for the children in most cases is for them to be with their family unit.
Well, it sounds like in every respect, it's very expensive to be poor in America. And of course, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have boots in the first place. Conor, I'm going to come back to you. And I'd like to know whether you think you are too young to help make a positive change in race relations. And what do you think adults should be doing more of to help you secure your future?
Yes, sir. I definitely do not think that you are ever too young to start making change. My mom always says progress and change comes with no age limit. So I try to live by that motto every day. And I just think that starts in your community, doing things to help better yourself and others and help encourage change. by being the change that you would like to see in your community. And then that just spreads. I think it's harder for adults to sort of connect with this generation because social media is really the glue to how the younger generation shows and how they can express themselves through their posts and beliefs. So I believe adults should try to understand what our ultimate goals are and just keep supporting them and encouraging others to do the same. And that is how change can spread.
Dr. Laws Barker, has your education made you immune to racism from your colleagues and patients? Also, how can people overcome racism in the healthcare setting to ensure that the care that they receive is as good as others are getting?
Thank you. No, I don't think that your education ever makes you immune to racism. In fact, I think that there are some instances where the pressure of racism can be more once you attain a professional position. What happens often to professionals, African American and of color, is when you attain a position, for instance, like me, a physician, you feel like you have to work extra hard. You have to constantly prove that you deserve to be there. You deserve to be present. And a lot of times your presence can make other people uncomfortable because maybe they haven't interacted with a physician of color or an attorney of color or a professor of color. So there is a lot of pressure to always be the best, not to make a mistake, to always be educated. For instance, as I went to pursue my MBA, I had someone say to me, I see you're going to educate yourself. And those kind of statements feel atrocious because I felt like I was educated. I'm just increasing my education. I'm not educating myself. And so I feel like a lot of physicians of color and professionals of color have an added pressure. And then the patient situation, sometimes you walk into the room and they didn't expect you and they don't know how to interact with you. And then you have to reevaluate yourself and you find yourself again trying to prove yourself to the patient that you're competent enough to be their doctor. And so it's very difficult as you move along, but communicating with others and seeking out people that are supportive of your presence is the main thing that helps. And as Attorney Chartier said, you know, when you look at your history and then people realize how much we have in common, having colleagues that will support you and work with you really helps make it easier, but it is very difficult and you are not immune.
What people of color can do to ensure that the care that they are receiving is as good as others?
Absolutely. I encourage all of my patients and any patients that people that I speak to on a panel or whatever to be informed. Always know what your rights are in healthcare. And if you feel like you're not getting good healthcare, it's okay to go someplace else. I think patients have a difficult time understanding that they can, quote, fire a doctor or that there is an advocate for them. For instance, at the institution that I work at, if a patient feels like they're not getting good healthcare, they can call the advocacy center. They can talk to someone about their rights. Always, always step out and say, and speak up and say, this isn't working, or this doesn't feel right, or I have concerns. So I encourage patients not to just take any care, not to just accept what is given to them, but know your rights and speak up for yourself.
Yes, you have to sound off. You have to sound off. Now, Mary, does mental health have a place in this discussion at all about injustice and the next steps?
Absolutely. Mental health is critical to the criminal prosecution system that you and I work in. You see individuals who need mental health treatment, but they don't get it. They are put in cages in jail or in prisons, and that mental health component is ignored. And what's interesting is over the many years I've worked as a criminal defense lawyer, we see that individuals who now have gotten addicted to opiates. Right? There's been a real push, and it's a tragedy. And there's a real push for them to go into rehab. But again, people who are addicted to what would be considered more street level drugs, right? Crack cocaine, we just lock them up, right? They're criminals. So you see that disparity in addiction, which to me really is a healthcare issue. And, Dr. Laz Barker probably could speak to that 1,000 times better than I. But mental health isn't a crime. Having a mental health problem isn't a crime. You don't lock someone up because they're diabetic. You don't lock someone up because they have cancer. Someone shouldn't be locked up because they have a mental health issue. And it is ignored over and over and over again. And it's ignored more systemically for people of color. Individuals are locked up. And again, when I say a cage, it really is a cage. For people who've never been to a jail or prison, and I'm not talking about the sanitized tour that a politician takes, I mean the real jail or prison, it is a cage that they are in. And when we are going to put our fellow citizens in cages, I think we should be darn sure that that's the place that they belong. Not because they're mentally ill, not because they're poor, not because they're addicted to alcohol or a substance, but because they are a danger to the community, and that's where they need to be. And that's not what's happening. So mental health we see impact us over and over and over again. And I'm pleased to hear the conversation about defunding the police. It doesn't mean we don't have police anymore, but it does mean, are police the best individuals to respond alone to certain circumstances? And we put a lot on them, right? They've got to be social workers and, police officers and community individuals and everything. Why not bring in real professionals to deal with these issues, which the conversation is moving that way, and I hope it continues to move that way. We actually see action and not just conversation.
Mary, to your point about police officers doing the job of social workers, there's a reason that Dr. Laz Barker, as marvelous a doctor as she is, because of what type of medicine she practices, there's a reason she won't see me in her professional capacity. Right.
And the same thing like for us, right? If you come to us with a bankruptcy issue, I'm pointing you down the street. We don't do our own taxes. We stay in our lane. We do criminal defense litigation, and that's it. We don't do anything else. Police officers should stay in their lane, and they're being pushed and pulled in all these different directions when really we need to bring in other professionals. People go to school to be doctors and counselors and social workers. Let's bring in these experts. Let's bring in that intelligence. And that's when I spoke, earlier about, we ignore that, right? I mean, some people, they think it's cool or good. You hear politicians talk about, ignoring science, in favor of what? I mean, that's why we are right now. It's not this dichotomy between the police and Black Lives Matter or science and business. I mean, that dichotomy is set up there to divide us. We need to bring people together and unite people. We can solve these problems. We just need to pull together and do it. And if government officials aren't going to do it, you have young people like Conor who are saying, step aside, right? We're the generation that's going to make you do it. We're not going to just listen to this rhetoric and platitudes. We are going to vote, and we are going to demand the communities that we all deserve.
Can I interrupt for a second? I think Mary had a really good point, but isn't also part of the problem that from a political perspective, it looks good on paper to say, oh, we're adding policemen, we're funding the policemen, and it doesn't look as quote unquote sexy to have social workers and therapists. And that's really the problem, that just like Mary pointed out, we're asking police officers to be something they really haven't trained to do, but it looks better on paper from a politician's perspective than it does from a practical point of view for the people on the street who are having to engage with the system.
The other thing too, Liisa, is we control who represents us, whether it's in Washington or in the state, right? People can get up there and say whatever they want at a campaign rally or in their campaign literature. It doesn't matter how many corporations or lobbyists fund politicians if we don't vote for those individuals. And it is on us to demand more than these platitudes and rhetoric, right? When someone says they're a law and order candidate, well, what does that mean? When someone says we're going to lock up people who commit crimes, I mean, it is upon us to demand, what does that mean? What exactly does it mean? And if you are saying mandatory minimums for drug crimes, that's a kind of positive for this country, and it has not. It has devastated our country. If someone is going to continue to stand behind that, it is up to us to push that issue and to demand the media do more than just report things for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. As Conor said, with social media now, there are all these different platforms where we can delve into issues. It then is incumbent on the voter to demand that we get true responses from politicians and not the same old nonsense that they keep spouting. And if they refuse to do it, there are other individuals who will do it, and we need to vote in November and every single election to make sure our voices are being heard.
That's what I was going to say. I think what's most important about this moment in time, that for so long, African American people and community of colors have felt like they didn't have a voice. And before, your voice could only be heard a certain way. And as Conor stated, with social media and even with peaceful protesting, this is an opportunity for the people to be heard. And I like that. I like seeing that people's voices are being heard. They need to feel like they have not just a seat at a table, but a voice at the table. When you're making decisions for me, without me, it doesn't help me. And so I believe such a time as this, a moment like this, is so powerful to ensure that the people's voices are heard.
Now, Conor, with the little bit of time that we have left, it looks like you're going to close us out. But, you know, we heard Dr. Laws Barker talk about how her education doesn't make her immune from discrimination, either from colleagues or patients. But again, you know, you're a superstar athlete, and hopefully you don't forget me once you make it to the NFL. I'll take a ticket on the 50-yard line, please, a seat on the 50-yard line. But I'd like to know whether you experience discrimination in the classroom and during your extracurricular activities. Again, you have a job and you do all sorts of other things. So discrimination in the classroom and during extracurricular activities, do you experience it?
Yes, sir. I was in 8th grade, and this kid had came up to me, and he was laughing really hard, and he showed me a picture, and he must have thought it was a joke or, you know, something pretty comical, I don't know. But it was a picture of a darker complected black man and a gorilla. And the caption on the picture said, "See the resemblance." And he just showed me, and he must have thought that I was going along with the joke. But it was just very, very offensive. And I felt sick to my stomach, just like, why would somebody, you know, anybody think that that's funny or want to make fun of that? As far as during extracurricular activities, during football games, we played different opponents. They have shouted the N-word at me and a few other of my teammates. Just other things like, you know, getting kicked on the ground, like while you're, you know, down after getting tackled, or, you know, just little things like that. And I think in the workforce, it's a little more not so vivid or not so, you know, in the light, but maybe just smaller things, you know, whispering, you know, you serve food to somebody's car. Maybe they'll whisper something to somebody else and, you know, just start giggling, and you may just say, "Hey, what was that for?" So it's just certain things that may get under your skin, but at the end of the day, you can't, you know, let that define you, or you can't, you know, let that bring you down. You just have to know who you are and, you know, just stay and, you know, believe in your principles and the things that you have, you know, learned, and just keep at it.
Thank you for having us. And great comments by everybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.